Okay, so we'll get started now. Everyone, thank you for joining us. I'm Kyle Cleveland with Temple University's Institute of Contemporary Asian Studies. This panel has been in development for a while. I'd really especially like to thank Bo Jacobs, who's really chiefly responsible for organizing this by bringing in his colleagues, Norma and Yuki Miyamoto. So these are really eminent authorities on this subject, and this on the 75th commemoration of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. I don't think we could have more insightful people to be presenting on these issues. So the format today will be for each of the panelists to present briefly. Then maybe I'll ask a question or two. We may dialogue and we'll open it up generally. This will be a 2-hour session. Okay, so we'll get started here today with Yuki Miyamoto, who is an associate professor in the Department of Religious Studies at DePaul. The courses she teaches regularly are the Atomic Bomb Discourse and the Atomic Age. She's led study abroad programs to Hiroshima and Nagasaki 7 times. She's the author of Beyond the Mushroom Cloud, Commemoration, Religion, and Responsibility After Hiroshima. With Norma Field, she also helps curate the Atomic Age website. So our first presentation here will be by Yuki Miyamoto. Yuki, if you could share your screen.
Yes. Can you see my screen?
You can.
Now?
You could go full screen.
Yes, I will.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Kyle, very much for having me on board. I'm very honored to be with very prominent scholars on the same panel. And today's topic is managing nuclear memory, the journey from Hiroshima to Fukushima. And if you, so let me talk about your experiences if you indulge me in talking about it, because I was born and grew up in Hiroshima, and my mother was actually was there at the time of the bombing. But I would like to talk about today's talk in this order, which first I would like to talk about divergence. It seems like there are some different understandings of the atomic bombings and as well as nuclear weaponry in the United States and in Japan, and especially in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The divergence of discourse, which was also very much represented saliently in these photos in my mind. And the top one is Richland High School, and as you may know that this high school is outskirts of Hanford nuclear site, or bed town of Hanford nuclear site. And as you can see, the school mascot is the mushroom cloud, whereas the bottom photo is Hiroshima Dome, which is very much the symbol of the atomic bombing in the minds of many in Hiroshima. So it seems like there is a large divergence that in the United States, especially those areas where which thrived on the nuclear industry, was very proud of the mushroom cloud and technology, whereas people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and maybe Japan at large were more concerned about under the mushroom cloud. However, when we dig into this divergence a little bit more, we will see more common threads. And first thing I would like to point out, and hopefully later we can expand this notion of silence in our dialogues and conversations. So I want to talk about silence from my experiences, and then I would like to touch upon some collaborations, how the memory was actually managed, quote unquote, managed, and that was also not just Japan alone, but also international collaborations. So my mother was at the age of 6, and my mother was 6 years old at the time of the bombing. And here is the hypo center, and she was, despite the summer, she was at school, and I never asked her why, but most of the school kids were mobilized and they were in the city, and that was part of the reason mobilized to clear the area so that to prevent the fire from incendiary bombs or some other military efforts. So that's part of the reasons lots of victims were school kids. And my mother's school was 1.2 or 1.6 kilometers from the hypocenter. I think the current location is 1.2 kilometers, but for some reasons, my mother's health book says 1.6 kilometers. And I don't know much about afterwards. She never told me, and this is the theme of silence. She wanted to, well, my guess is that she didn't want to talk about it because that is to revisit the memory, the horrific memory, and to relive that moment. And she might be, she might be dreadful. But I also guess that a large part, she wanted to protect me from discrimination, which is the topic I will moving on to. But in the meantime, let me talk a little bit more about her life. In her 30s, I don't know much about her in her teens and 20s, but in her 30s, she was diagnosed with Meniel's disease. So she had a hard time in standing up. She was often lying. And in the 40s, she had to get the blood booster for some reason, because her blood production, her organs that produce blood was not working well, so it was not producing healthy blood cells. So she needed some quote unquote booster every other week, which I actually didn't know. I was already in junior high and high school student, but she didn't tell me. And then in her 50s, she developed the cancer and passed away at the age of 62 in 2001. So it has been a while, but she has been suffering, kind of suffering in silence. And so that was part of the reasons that I was very hesitant to use the term survivor, because when it comes to radiation exposure, you never know if you survived until your death. So that was my personal history and discrimination, how discrimination shapes the memory, and also why silence. And because in the fear of discrimination, especially for a girl, which is recurring in Fukushima, and it breaks my heart. But young girls especially, or parents who have young girls, who are very concerned about their reproductive functions. But I want to talk a little bit about Genbaku Tome. They are often referred to as Hiroshima Maidens. And the most known case was perhaps in 1955 when 26 Hiroshima Maidens were brought to the United States to have free reconstruction surgeries. And they appeared in This Is Your Life, which is a program known for Reverend Kiyoshi Tanimoto's episode. And he's also, excuse me, he appears in John Hersey's Hiroshima. So his name was known in the United States. But when those two women, so Reverend Kiyoshi Tanimoto accompanied the Hiroshima Maidens. And in Kiyoshi Tanimoto's episode in This Is Your Life, two Hiroshima Maidens appeared. However, they were behind the screen and they were introduced as to avoid causing, quote, to avoid causing any embarrassment, we will show you their faces. Perhaps back in the 50s, just generally, women or any Japanese person might not want to show their faces in public. That might be a little bit embarrassing in general. But at the same time, I was wondering, this statement raises a question of what kind of embarrassment, who should be embarrassed? And so all those questions. But those recently, especially Asian American scholars were criticizing this Hiroshima Maiden project because it was not about their plight, but rather reconstructing American identity, post-war American identity, how generous, how benevolent they are. So that's the critique. But the same thing actually had already happened 3 years before in Japan. Those women were used again to sort of as a symbol of reconciliation between the Japanese military and hibakusha, or the victims of the war. What happened was women who were severely affected by the atomic bombing externally, they were brought to Tokyo to have surgeries. But the first place they were brought to was not actually to the hospital, but to the Sugamo prison. And what happened was they met, it was set up that they were greeting to Class A war criminals, as if, and then that was largely disseminated that this is a gesture of reconciliation between the military and those war victims. And especially in 1952, looking at the Japan's independence is on the horizon, and there was a movement to exonerate those war criminals. So those Hiroshima Maidens or Genbaku Otome were used as a part of that propaganda. And partly because they were, because they needed a surgery, and I don't think that because they were considered that they would have a hard time in marrying, had to have a spouse. And I don't think that a heterogeneous marriage promises happiness. But back in the 50s, there were not many ways for women to lead an financially independent life. So another thing which I haven't thoroughly researched, but Nagasaki Mr. Moriguchi informed me that there were some women actually sent to the USSR as a kind of making a counter narrative to Americans' narrative that they were helping the former enemies, they were generous. So in order to counter that sort of narrative, the USSR and the Japanese Communist Party were they brought some women to the USSR, which I haven't researched. I don't know where to study it. So, but I just wanted to mention that. And next thing is discrimination to shape the memory. Let me go back here. Kondo Nobuyoshi, a member of Tokyo Metropolitan Assembly, proposed the sterilization of hibakusha in 1976. So I'm going a little bit forward, but 30 years after the atomic bombing, this assembly member proposed this. It was because some people were claiming that children of hibakusha need some health care. And in order to block that appeal or the demand, Kondo proposed this. And this bill didn't pass, thankfully. However, he was not an obscure figure in this assembly. Actually, he was elected 4 times consecutively and very popular member, LDP, of course. And also, he is a medical doctor. So this sort of idea was coming up in the 70s. And I was also concerned about, okay, for some reason, I'm not showing one, let me, okay. So I'm concerned about, like, for example, last month, the death of an ALS patient. And another example was just 2 years or 4 years ago, there were 19 patients at this facility where physically and mentally challenged people were living. This former staff member killed 19 members, and the perpetrator was 26 years old man. He was not regretting at all what he had done. He was saying, well, there were some people who do not worth living. So I'm very concerned about this radiation effect, hereditary effect, the idea of worthlessness, and they seem to be all coming back together. So that's why I am adding. And collaboration, just very briefly, being aware of the time. So this year, as you may know, the ceremonies, yesterday's ceremony in Hiroshima and on August 9th, Nagasaki ceremony will be held in a very different way. And this kind of disruption due to COVID-19 this time disruption itself is not new. In 1950, because of the Korean War and still the SCAP, the Supreme Command of the Allied Powers, was still occupying in Japan, and the SCAP ordered Hiroshima City not to hold the ceremony this year because of the fear of the anti-American sentiment. And what's the response of the city? And actually Mayor Hamai Shindo, who is known as the A-bomb mayor, who sort of laid out the post-war Hiroshima city planning. So he was very famous city mayor. However, he was actually on a grand tour going to Europe and to the United States, and invited by this obscure religious group, Moral Rearmament, which was big during the intern war period between the First and Second World War. But this religious group, which also had something to do with SCAP's SCAP's administration, but they were recruiting Hiroshima mayor, Nagasaki mayor for this tour. And in Los Angeles, Mayor Hamai made a speech, and it was almost like, as if nothing had happened. And this nothing had happened is another theme recurring in Fukushima, in Norma Field's article in the Asia Pacific Journal, the recent article. So as if nothing had happened, just him being in the United States by the invitation of MRA was a gesture of reconciliation, and nothing fundamentally important things was never discussed. So this is my presentation, and let me stop share. So discrimination, because of that, in the fear of discrimination, there was silence imposed or self-censored silence, and which also is happening in Fukushima, and the collaboration, how memory is shaped by not just people who are involved in the historical events, but also other external force sort of shaped the idea and made it in a good story, good narrative, which became dominant. And that is something I would like to talk about in the in line of nuclear memory. Thank you.
Yuki, thank you very much for your presentation. Everyone, as we're going through here, if you could enter any questions into the chat window, we'll pull those out and I'll read those when we get to that part of the webinar. Next up, we have Bo Jacobs. Bo is a historian of science and technology at the Hiroshima Peace Institute and the Graduate School of Peace Studies at Hiroshima City University in Japan, researching the history of nuclear technologies. He's the author of The Dragon's Tail on Nuclear Bodies, and also has been the lead researcher in the Global Hibakusha Project since 2010, conducted field research at radiation-affected sites around the world. Again, I just want to thank Bo very much for really being primarily responsible for convening these wonderful people for this panel. And Bo, if you could.
Well, thank you, Kyle, and thanks, Yuki, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. And if you're joining us from Asia, why are you awake and joining us? But thank you for joining us anyways. I'm from Chicago, which is where Norma and Yuki are, and I'm here in Yuki's hometown, Hiroshima. And my focus is global hibakusha, which I'll explain a little more in a moment. But just to put in a little origin story for myself, in 1942 in Chicago, in December of 1942, was the first self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction. This was the Chicago Pile 1, the first functioning, small functioning nuclear reactor, an experimental reactor. And it was from this that it was understood that it was possible to generate, to basically make a nuclear power plant work. And this was done, as many people know, under the squash courts under the stands of the University of Chicago. And my mother in 1942 was a 16-year-old girl living about 7 blocks away from where that happened. Basically the safety protocols were people holding chemicals in buckets. There were really no safety protocols for this experiment in the middle of urban population of 3 million people. My research is on what's called the Global Hibakusha. I've been working on a project called the Global Hibakusha Project for 10 years with my co-researcher, Mick Broderick from Murdoch University in Australia. And the main focus of Global Hibakusha is essentially all of the people that have been exposed to radiation and affected by nuclear technologies that we typically don't think of. So as many people know, undoubtedly, nuclear weapons began to be tested after the war, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, less than a year after the attack on Hiroshima. Nuclear weapons were detonating again in the Marshall Islands. And that during the course of the Cold War, there were over 2,000 nuclear weapon tests. We think of the Cold War as a period of time in which nuclear weapons were not used. Statistically, there was a nuclear weapon detonating every 8.6 days in the Cold War. So the Cold War was a period of time in which nuclear weapons were going off a lot. We think that the Cold War didn't happen because it didn't happen to us, but it did happen to other people. And these people were typically people in colonial, post-colonial spaces, essentially people that were not politically powerful enough to keep this from happening to them. So millions of people were exposed to radiation from nuclear weapon testing, especially in the Pacific, in French Polynesia, in the Marshall Islands, in the nation of Kiribati, in Kazakhstan, the primary testing center of the Soviet Union, in Algeria, in Australia, in the Soviet Arctic, in a wide variety of places in China, where the Uyghur population is located, is where the Chinese test site was. Additionally, from nuclear production, from the manufacturing of both nuclear weapons and especially fuel for nuclear power plants, lots more people were exposed to radiation and a lot more places were devastated and contaminated. This starts with uranium mining. It goes on to processing the uranium, which was done in literally hundreds of sites all around the world in various nuclear weapon states, and then especially the production of plutonium. And as, for example, in Hanford, Washington, where Yuki showed the photo from the high school. And the way that you manufacture plutonium is that you operate nuclear power plants. Many people think nuclear power plants came after nuclear weapons, but nuclear power plants were invented before nuclear weapons. Nuclear power plants were invented by the Manhattan Project to manufacture plutonium. That's their primary use. When the United States had its first commercial nuclear power plant in Shippingport, in Pennsylvania in 1958, it was actually the 14th nuclear power plant operating in the United States. There were already 13 nuclear power plants operating. They did not generate electricity. They strictly generated plutonium. The people who lived near these plutonium processing power plants were exposed to a wide variety of radiation, and a lot of radiological material entered the ecosystems where they lived. And additionally, there are nuclear accidents. There's lots of nuclear accident sites. The first 2 very large nuclear accidents happened in 1957 within 11 days of each other. But these happened in the plutonium production reactors of nuclear weapon states, so they were not terribly well known in the Soviet Union and also the Windscale fire in the UK. People are more familiar with Chernobyl and of course Fukushima. So an emphasis that I would like to put is on distance. These things happen far away from where we live, most of us. I'm not sure there's a lot of people here, but for the most part, this happened in places we don't see. And so in our minds, it didn't really happen. We're able to think that this happened over there. Just like in America, it's possible to think that Hiroshima and Nagasaki were attacked over there. But there was so much radiation that entered into the ecosystem that it distributed globally. It's everywhere, especially because of large hydrogen bombs, which carried fallout into the troposphere, into the upper atmosphere, where the fallout might circle the Earth for 4 or 5 years before it deposited and drifted back down. And so it drifted back down everywhere. Radiation is so widely distributed in the world that, for example, we can tell if paintings are forgeries. We can tell if a painting was painted before 1945, because if it was painted after 1945, there are traces of radiation from nuclear weapon testing in the fibers of the canvas and in the paint. So it's penetrated, for example, even in Nagasaki today, recent research has shown that there is more radiation present in the soil in Nagasaki from global nuclear weapon testing than there is from the actual nuclear attack on Nagasaki. But we think that we're distant from these things and it happened somewhere else, but there is no somewhere else. And also, I would like to express that we also have some distance in time from what may be the real impacts of these technologies. We have several 100,000 metric tons just of spent nuclear fuel from nuclear power plants and from manufacturing plutonium. These will be dangerous for over 100,000 years. And essentially the best plan anybody has come up with is to put them in deep geological storage, which means to put them about 0.5 kilometer underground. We pretend that we have the expertise and the technology to make this work with no problem at all, but it's also, we're talking 100,000 years. So it's not unrealistic to think of these as essentially radioactive landfills. So there will be 1,000 generations that have a relationship with this fuel. Most of that relationship will be risk, and we had a small benefit from it in the form of electricity, or if you believe in nuclear weapons, in the form of security. So this material has a long journey ahead of it, and untold numbers of people are involved in that journey. So this is a material that penetrates around the world. This is a material that penetrates deep into time. We've been told from the beginning to not worry about this. We've been told in Hiroshima that people didn't die of radiation. We have not had, all of our medical databases built on risk from radiation are related to external gamma radiation. But the global hibakusha that I study, almost all of them experienced radioactive fallout, like the black people where the black rain was, and they internalized particles inside of them. Those particles can last anywhere from a few days, or in the case of cesium-137, which is a real problem in places like Chernobyl and Fukushima, 300 years. Other material can last far longer. And once these materials enter an ecosystem, they move around like any chemical in an ecosystem, and they move around with the dynamics of wind flow and water flow and floral growth and so forth and so on. We've been told not to worry about any of this, that the level of radiation is so small, there's nothing to worry about, but everywhere this has happened, people have gotten sick. So I'd just like to close by saying that this project, this is material I've been studying for a long time, but the project, the Global Hibakusha Project, which brought us to a lot of these locations around the world to do field work, started in 2010. And a year after it started, there was a massive nuclear disaster in northern Japan, the Fukushima disaster. And I can only tell you that it was horrifying to watch all of this discourse of calming people, dismissing their fears, and dismissing risk and danger to them that I had seen in all of these other locations, and to watch it be put into operation in real time in the lives of people who were scared, whose lives had been upended, and who were now facing risks they didn't understand. And so managing people is always much easier than actually managing the radioactive materials. So this is what happens. We manage the people. And so I look forward to our discussion later. And thank you all. I'll see you in, or I'll speak in a little bit. I'll see you now.
Great, thank you very much, Bo. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great, thank you. Norma is with us today. Norma Field is a professor emerita at the University of Chicago and the Department of Asian Languages and Civilizations. She is the author of In the Realm of the Dying Emperor, Japan at Century's End. She is editor and co-translator of Fukushima Radiation, Will You Still Say No? Crime Has Been Committed. With Yuki Miyamoto, she maintains the Atomic Age website. And Norma, if you could speak now. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Kyle. And I am truly honored. This is a customary thing to say, but I really mean it, to be allowed to join real experts like Bo and Yuki. And I'm so stimulated by what they've said. I hope I have something to add to you, and I'll be very interested in everyone's views on this matter. I'm going to focus on Fukushima today. When the Fukushima disaster happened in 2011, it seemed to me to coalesce so many of the issues I had been concerned with in my adult life, about inequality, the nature of power, the ways in which people, against their own interests, succumb to and collaborate with power, secrecy, a very big theme. So it totally consumed me, and in fact, it has been the focal point of my retirement life. I would like to say that when it happened, so many colleagues at the University of Chicago, remember a major site of the Manhattan Project, would say, Norma, it's so ironic in Japan of all places that this should have happened, as if it were peculiarly unfair that this had happened to Japan. Well, it was distinctly unfair that it happened to those people, which is actually everybody and beyond Japan. But we have to remember that the Japanese government has never, ever been interested in protecting Japanese people from the impact of radiation exposure. And that's comes very early on, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it continues with the enthusiastic embrace of Atoms for Peace. That's the title of Eisenhower's famous speech in 1953 December, which just preceded the big explosion in Bikini 3 months later. And the embrace of nuclear power, which went along with the idea that Japanese people had to be gotten over their nuclear allergy in order to join the modern world and have access to this wonderful source of power in an energy poor country. We're all very conscious of colonialism and neocolonialism these days. And I think there are important ways that we have to invoke this, or specifically in this context. And one is the very siting of nuclear power plants in Japan under this wonderful program of Atoms for Peace, which is to pick locales that actually don't need that much electricity, didn't need them, that were experiencing depopulation and economic downturns. And lo and behold, so many nuclear power plants end up being sited in those places. It is worth remembering, because we so often think Japanese people don't resist, that I think it's something like close to 50%, perhaps more, of the proposals actually did not come to be. There was that much tenacity and local resistance. What we know about are the places where it happened, because they have produced problems, notably Fukushima Daiichi, which, let us not forget, produced electricity only for Tokyo and not the Tohoku region. The other kind of neo-colonialism we have to remember is, for example, with the 3 non-nuclear principles of not making, not storing, not transporting, Okinawa was used as a storage point of nuclear power. So the amount of hypocrisy that has gone on in Japan itself on the part of the Japanese government about the nuclear regime is something we can never overlook. So let me, at this point, share some images with you. Let's see. And this. Share. And we'll go to slideshow. Can everyone see it? Yeah, okay. This is a familiar kind of map, but I just thought it was worth rehearsing. Concentric circles, the concentric circle notion that radioactivity travels in concentric circles in distance, which of course was adopted early on in Hiroshima and Nagasaki as a mechanism for managing compensation and liability. That was, I think, a principal function that it served. And this quickly was set in place in Fukushima. So of course we know that doesn't happen. We know that atmospheric conditions, meteorological conditions enormously impact the journey of radioactive particles and microparticles, and that journey is continuing today. Bo's already referred to that. Well, maybe I won't go to that yet. One of the things, and right after Fukushima happened, many of you remember anecdotal reports, but there was a great deal of it, of people fleeing Fukushima, of cars with Fukushima license plates having their tires slashed. That kind of thing happened all the time. There was also quick anticipation and embrace of the threat of discrimination. I remember a friend whose husband ran a boarding school, high school through junior college and college, and he started getting applications from Fukushima parents who wanted their middle school-aged children to be accepted. They refused them because they don't take middle school-aged boarders, but the whole point was to try to get their children away from any record of having had anything to do with Fukushima as early as possible, so that they would not face the marriage and employment discrimination known to have happened with people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I think a lot about, I have tried and always have urged students when I was teaching not to rely on Japanese exceptionalism. That is to say, Japanese culture is somehow mysteriously but resolutely unique, and therefore accounts for a number of different phenomena that we say that we may praise or object to. And in the case of Fukushima, when I think about Fukushima and the readiness with which discrimination, worries about discrimination and use of discrimination, I'll get to that later, how quickly those were invoked, I think that yes, I mean, I don't accept cultural exceptionalism, but I do think that every culture, every society has developed, has been shaped by historical events and the impact those events have had on the power structure of that society. And I'm sometimes, post-Fukushima, I've been led to wonder if, given that so many young people know very little about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I'll interrupt myself again by saying that paper crane folding, everyone knows about that, right? And like me, sometimes you may be susceptible to being cynical, like, yep, you can fold 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, a million paper cranes, and it's not going to do anything about the nuclear regime. But I remember being at a university, a public institution out in the West once, and there were exchange students from Japan, and there was an event, nuclear event, and these young women were teaching paper crane folding, and in talking to them, I realized that they had known virtually nothing about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but the fact that they were going to be obligated to teach paper crane folding to American students had made them look up some things about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So anyway, I wonder if the most enduring legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan hasn't been to trigger the discrimination reaction, both worry about becoming associated with such a person, as in a daughter or even a son-in-law, but also to become susceptible to it. So with that, I'll go back to this slide. One of the illnesses recognized, one of the few illnesses, really the only official illness recognized, official meaning by the International Nuclear industry and its so-called regulators, the UN organizations, all except the Human Rights Organization, are all promoters essentially of nuclear power. And so what they do is manage how to keep it going in spite of setbacks like Chernobyl and Fukushima. The only officially recognized illness is pediatric thyroid cancer. And of course, this has been found in extraordinary, relative to how rare the disease is thought to be, numbers in Fukushima through the Fukushima Prefectural Health Survey. I use this picture because this was really an electrifying moment, which was dubbed as, I have labeled here, a coming out on the part of thyroid cancer children parents. And as you can see, this is 2016, this was remote. The press conference, the press, the media were in a room in Tokyo, and the parents, two fathers, perhaps not surprising, were connected remotely, and they were only shown on their torsos. And they, obviously, a way to manage the press conference was to have them identifiable, distinguishable. So one parent was dressed in black and the other in white. And the moderator referred to them as the person in black and the person in white. What is really stunning, I think, about this is how the victims, in a sense, are treated like criminals, like they are the perpetrators who can't show their faces. It's interesting to think about what Yuki said about embarrassment and face showing, but this is alive and well. And this is an experiment that has not been repeated as far as I know. I think there have been a couple of programs in NHK since, but this kind of attempt to share one's plight as a parent of a thyroid cancer child, it was a very, very brave thing to do and felt to be too risky, even in this form. Nuclear education about nuclear issues has been, of course, a really big issue since then. This particular shot is from, it has a fancy, nonsensical International Science Research Center built in Miharu Township in Fukushima, which has lavish facilities. And this is a whole wing devoted for community relations. And on the day when I happened to go, there was an event, an activity for very young children who were being encouraged by a lively young woman to hop up and down and use paper, rock, and scissors to overcome different particles and rays. So in this particular, the part that's translated, it is that you can use scissors to get over, to block off beta rays. So yes, this is early childhood education. And actually, I haven't done detailed study of this, but the supplementary textbooks issued by the Ministry of Education from early on have in fact been regressive, which is to say, they've more and more backed away from implying the risks of exposure, certainly of exposure to the levels shown in Fukushima. So that the education, the notion that it is better to know about your environmental conditions to protect yourselves. I mean, you would think that there is the neoliberal notion that it's all personal responsibility, but there's also this added boost from the government and official sources, and particularly education, to make sure that the resources you have for shouldering your personal responsibility are very limited. This is a book that came out in 2018. A number of my friends in Fukushima were surprised and annoyed that I had bothered to purchase it because and the belief that you should not buy books that benefit the enemy. It's got a very peculiar, difficult to translate title. The part in brackets, which I put in quotes, is Fukushima Discrimination. And the point of this book, which is a collection of these essays by various notables, is discrimination against Fukushima that creates unhappiness. And if we can learn to ward off discrimination from outside, as well as discriminatory tendencies within ourselves, by which they mean worrying about exposure for yourselves and especially your children. The route to happiness is to get past that and to be on guard against it. I just want to point out, for example, here's a name of Ryugo Hayano, former physicist from the University of Tokyo. He's back in the news, I'm happy to say, well, sort of, because the paper he had published on one of the cities in Date, where he was an advisor, has had to be retracted. But not because, for example, he and his collaborator had used 1 month's worth of data, monitoring data, to count for 3 months. Now, even a mathematical wimp like me and a non-scientist can see that if you use 1 month's worth of data and call it covering 3 months, hey, the exposure levels are so negligible, they can't count for anything. Well, that's not the part in question. The other part in question is that they used the data of 10,000, I'm not sure it was 10,000, but a huge number of Date city citizens used their data without ever having tried to secure their consent. This is disappointing for the Japanese government and places like the institutions like the International Commission for Radiological, ICRP, because they really wanted to use this data. And it might be a little bit clumsier to do so now. This person, Shimizu Tsuji, is a sociologist. He was kind of speaking out on behalf of Fukushima people, but more recently he has begun to say things about the prefectural health survey, like, well, the results aren't definitive. And don't you think if the results aren't definitive, then it's better not to cause people needless worry. So there's a whole move familiar from nuclear governance everywhere in the world, probably. Best not to look, best not to research, because you might find out there's a problem. And here, why not give people psychological peace by not looking into something where the results are not clear? I've also asked you to note the soft pastel colors in the children. There's a lot of cutesiness, necessary cutesiness, I think, on the part of all science and nuclear matters, because it's so scary. And in this case, it's to get people to, this is really trying to reinforce the message, you can be happy and your children can be happy if you stop worrying. In other cases, it's to try to get people to watch films or learn things or take their children to be monitored, to use pastel colors and inviting non-scary images so that people, to help encourage them to explore reality. Here, recent wonderful news. We hope it stands. It's important. Bo referred to black rain earlier. This is a judgment just last week in Hiroshima District Court, where these are plaintiffs in their late 70s and 90s. So think about the long time they've had to suffer, who found, for whom the chief judge of the Hiroshima District Court found in their favor that indeed they were entitled to be recognized as black rain sufferers and that they should be acknowledged as such and get any benefits coming from that. The issue here is that black rain, which Bo referred to earlier, and probably most people know, with that along with all the soot and particles swept up from the bombing, the fire, incineration, the radioactive particles, some of which come down as black rain, and of course, watered the earth. People drank the water in their wells and they ate the vegetables, meaning that they ingested it internally, which causes you to have these radionuclides, radioactive materials in your body essentially forever, certainly for an individual person. Now, there was a delimited area which the government was willing to recognize, and I think that happened in the late 70s, 78 or so, 76, 78. And since then, research done not by activists, so-called scientists, but a number of scientists of a number of disciplines by the city of Hiroshima, maybe with help from the prefecture, which came up with an area 6 times larger than what had previously been recognized. So there are 2 things I want to point out with this new judgment. One is that the acknowledgement of low-level and internal contamination, which is a very hard thing to come by in official circles, certainly in the judiciary. And the second is that so many, if you read about the personal stories of the plaintiffs, so many of them had kept their exposure a secret most of their lives. And it was only when they saw other people speaking up and joining a lawsuit that they decided to speak out. A friend of mine in Fukushima, learning about this judgment, said, you know, if the kids today, if the 10-year-old today has to wait 75 years to have their thyroid cancer or many, many other symptoms acknowledged, they're going to be 85. True enough. And I just quickly want to say something about the breadth of this problem, global, as Bo said, and Yuki was implying too. This is a Senate report from 1983, I think, put together by then Congressman, now Senator from Massachusetts, Ed Markey. It's called American Nuclear Guinea Pigs, 3 decades of radiation experiments on US citizens. That title tells it all, that this testing, the readiness for warfare, was also being carried out on the backs of US citizens and everybody else. In fact, I wonder if we couldn't say that the nuclear age is synonymous with the human experimentation and environmental experimentation, that there's no way to get past it. And there's a sentence that Ed Markey says in the summary, introductory summary, American citizens thus became nuclear calibration devices. It's an important issue all around. And I don't want to single out this particular case because it's any worse than others, but one of the cases taken up in this report took place at the University of Chicago. The University of Chicago, as well as a few other universities, show up many times. 1961 to 64, 102 students and staff were, I guess, happily consented to volunteering for this experiment, where they were ingesting either simulated fallout from the Nevada test site or actual fallout. This is a small boy shot. It's interesting to know that Bo uses this as the wallpaper for his blog. But so there were university students, Chicago students and staff ingesting actual fallout from this shot. It was the last series of US atmospheric tests. So yeah, I think that is horrifying, A. And B, it is also interesting to note that in so many legal struggles, plaintiffs have a very hard time showing the harm of low dose and internal exposure. And yet, all of this experimentation has been going on with US tax dollars. The whole point of this kind of experiment of ingesting fallout, real or actual or simulated, was to try to figure out how such radioactive materials pass through the human body. So yes, I think ABCC and RERF and Hiroshima and Nagasaki, those institutions set up by the Japanese government, now fully supported, for which Japan is now a full collaborator, all of them have enormous data, of which just the tip of the iceberg comes out into the public, and the rest is kept somehow, almost, I think, hidden in plain sight to keep hibakusha, and that does essentially involve all of us if we think that it means radiation-affected people, from understanding the myriad conditions that may be ailing us. Thank you.
Thank you, Norma, and thank you, Yuki and Bo. Everyone, thank you for inputting some of your questions. By now we have about a half a dozen questions. And before we get to those, I'd like to put a couple of questions directly to the speakers. Bo, I think you were the only person who actually attended some of the commemoration ceremonies in the last couple of days. And initially it seemed like those had been canceled, but I think you mentioned that in fact there were a few held today or yesterday.
Yeah, here in Hiroshima, I'm not sure what will happen in Nagasaki. Here in Hiroshima, it was actually uncertain for a little while, but I first heard about a week ago that there was going to be a small ceremony in the park, where in front of the cenotaph, where the ceremony usually is held, but the park was not open to the public, and so it was by invitation. Maybe some people might have seen some of the video, but the seating was spaced out so that people were properly distant from each other, given that the concern, of course, is COVID-19. And then I think it was maybe 3 days ago, it was announced that Abe would be at the ceremony here, and he will be in Nagasaki. So I've been living in Hiroshima for 15 years, and I always go on August 6th, I always go down to the park and spend the day at the park. And but I myself, I go by the A-bomb dome, which is outside of the park. It's technically not in the park. And in the park, there's a fairly ritualized observance, and it's very somber. But over by the A-bomb dome, it's more rowdy. There's a lot of political activists there, and in the last 6 or 7 years, there's been a lot of right-wing activists too. And so I went down there. I knew I was not going to be able to go into the park during the ceremony, but I went down by the dome, and by the dome, it was not too different than usual. It was definitely not as many people, but there were a lot of people there, and there was a large section of anti-nuclear activists and a lot of speech making. There was a very large contingent of right-wing protesters. There might have been 100 police officers with helmets on. And so I'll just add that one of the reasons that I go over by the dome is that at 8:15, there's a die-in, and most people fall to the ground like they're dead. And when I was a young anti-nuclear activist in the 1970s, we would have die-ins at most of the protests, most of the anti-nuclear protests that I took part in. So for me, it connects me to my journey here. And so that was going on. But usually in Hiroshima on August 6th, there's just a massive amount of people and a lot of people from out of town. And the city is really, there's nobody from out of town, really in the city, hardly at all. So the city feels totally different. But down at the park, there still was a fairly large group over by the dome, and there still was a fairly large march from the dome to the electric power company to protest against nuclear power, which has been happening every year, and especially since Fukushima. So it was both muted and still happening. But I would say that the thing that struck me the most was that a lot of the people over by the A-bomb dome, who are just regular citizens, were watching the ceremony on their smartphones as they were sitting over by the A-bomb dome. And that reminded me of what the experience was like for everybody here when Obama came, because not only was nobody allowed in the park then, but you couldn't even be across the river from the park. You had to be 1 block further inland from there. So there was at least 10,000 people downtown, and nobody I know saw anything at all of Obama, but everybody was watching his speech on their phones. So it was, so that's how it was.
Hmm. Yes, I think at this time of year, everyone would have thought we would be into the Olympics, and there would have been kind of some impact on tourism, dark tourism to Hiroshima and Nagasaki in association with that. This is a question really to all three panelists. In terms of the remembrance of this being displaced or somehow impacted by COVID, how do you feel about the politics of that and the extent to which this has interrupted what had been a celebration that had been going on uninterrupted? Celebration isn't the right word, but a remembrance for the last 75 years.
I've already talked too much, but I want to put in a plug for a piece that Bo Jacobs and Ron, who's I saw, yes, Ron Zwigenberg, published recently in Counterpunch, which is, how did you put it? The American narrative of Hiroshima is a statue that needs toppling. And it's a fabulous article. So it doesn't pull any punches. And I learned so much from it and felt exhilarated by it, which doesn't happen so often these days. But I think this interruption, this is a call to the American narrative, but I think we can also think of it as a call to the Japanese narrative, whereby we have a government who absolutely is not interested in doing anything about the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons, has refused to take part even in the discussion thereof, while trying to capitalize off the notion that Japan is the only A-bomb nation in the history of the world. So I think it's up to everyone to make something sane and positive from this disruption. It certainly is sane and positive in terms of Fukushima, that this was an Olympics that was very much directed at putting paid to the Fukushima disaster, and coincidentally meant to end on August 9th, so that really it was to be a glorious celebration of the fact that Japan has overcome these extraordinary disasters and can lead the world in the way to live with radioactivity every day and through catastrophe.
Hmm. Bo, go ahead, Yuki. Thank you.
Thank you. I would also like to, when it comes to disruption, definitely the Olympics disrupted this discourse of Fukushima, and especially for people who are struggling or trying to raise a voice on radiation harm, radiation exposure. And the kind of COVID-19 took over this Olympics in a different way, not as exciting as the Olympics, but it's more ominous. But both are sort of disrupting this discourse. But I also want to point out that sometimes good stories can disrupt or distract our attention from the actual problems, such as I was talking about the Hiroshima Maidens, which are in the 80s. A couple of historians were talking about this is a manifestation of American benevolence. And of course, in Japan, as I said, those maidens were used for the political discourse, a reconciliation, so that Japan didn't have to look back on what they had done, their own war crimes. But also more benign case would be Sadako's story. That story itself is not a bad thing at all. It was very moving. It was important to know, but sometimes that was kind of watered down. Some of my students even didn't know that that was a story of radiation exposure. Some unfortunate girl who survived the bomb but later died from leukemia. But there was no discussion of how leukemia is associated with the bombing. So I was a little bit concerned about many kinds of stories that distract our attention from the issues of radiation exposure.
Hmm.
Thank you.
I had done research up in Fukushima, interviewing mayors of 5 of the evacuated towns nearby Daiichi, and we interviewed those mayors 3 separate occasions. And it was interesting to see over the course of about a 5-year trajectory that the Olympics seemed to be really driving all sorts of things. And in some ways it accelerated the cleanup because they wanted to put a kind of a public relations face on that to be able to demonstrate that they had done meaningful cleanup. But also all of the mayors felt that they had been they're being pushed back to re-inhabit those evacuated towns without really having proper decontamination efforts or having really done proper radiation effect research on that. So I know, Norma, you've done research up in Fukushima on these issues as well. Did you have that sense of the kind of an artificial timeline being compelled by the pending Olympics?
Oh, did I ever? And there's a kind of grotesque element to it too. In terms of the larger theme of silencing and those who are victimized embracing their victimization, there's so many manifestations of that. But as time went on, and particularly the torch relay route was announced, Futaba, I think, and one other, Okuma maybe, have been left out because they were still, despite this accelerated drive to compel especially so-called voluntary evacuees to come back, and the drive is by cutting off any kind of housing assistance. There's a little bit of a carrot too. If you come back, we'll give you, 50,000 yen to shop in local supermarkets, that kind of thing. Those areas, right, which house the reactors, were essentially still uninhabitable. And then the mayors decided they really, 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 really needed the torch to go through their towns too. And so Fukushima Prefecture considered this seriously, and early this year granted them their wish and said, yes, the torch relay can go through, which meant a very hurried cleanup just around the train stations. So, a few feet beyond the platforms, essentially you're still not supposed to go in. But all those townships on the coast, most directly, immediately impacted by the disaster, were in on the game of the torch relay. It has also been pointed out, but by only one maybe two elected officials that I know of so far, that this the Olympics in Tokyo has essentially meant the swooping up of construction labor. Which meant that, yes, great Fukushima reconstruction, but you weren't going to have the actual bodies to do any rebuilding after you've done the so-called decontamination, which is really just a transfer of radioactive materials elsewhere. So in fact, the whole reconstruction Olympics is contradictory to the core. Yeah,
it's a form of nation branding, I suppose. And I'm sure that one of the issues that they were very concerned with is that the world's anti-nuclear activists were going to descend on Sendai or Koriyama at the time that the torch relay started. And so they were getting in front of trying to manage that message. I went on 3 different bus tours up to the Daiichi plant with students. And the first 2 times they took us into this for a pre-visit briefing, this dilapidated building that was an old school, maybe an administrative office. And then the 3rd time we went, which was about 6 months ago, it had been completely rebuilt. And it looked like a luxury hotel. They had a 70-seat theater that had, a kind of an IMAX kind of theater and also the messaging was very, very different. They clearly had consultants from outside, probably foreign consultants that were helping them manage their message. There was a mea culpa and very unambiguous terms, taking responsibility and apologizing and saying that this was not a natural disaster, it was a man-made disaster. But it was so clear that you could reverse engineer from the upcoming Olympics for that kind of investment and decision to be made. So Bo, you've recently written an interesting article that I think Ron Zinberg linked to here. The American narrative, Hiroshima is a statue that must be toppled. And as we're talking here about political narratives, could you summarize that argument?
Absolutely. Ran and I published this article on August 6th on Counterpunch, an online journal in the United States. The title is The American Narrative of Hiroshima as a Statue That Must Be Toppled. And the American narrative of Hiroshima is a story about Americans. It starts with the splitting of the atom in Germany, and then it's mostly about Leo Szilard pitching the idea of a project to Franklin Roosevelt, the Manhattan Project, the locations of the Manhattan Project, the scientific challenges, how those challenges were met, the innovation that went into all of the steps of understanding the physics behind a weapon and tackling the engineering of achieving the weapon, the manufacturing, whenever we, in America, whenever we say we need to, handle a big problem, we need a Manhattan Project to do this or a Manhattan Project to do this. It's shorthand for, putting all of our smartest, most capable abilities to it. And then there's also an obsession with the decision to drop the bomb. And, historians, we know there was no decision. Truman really hardly, Leslie Groves, the military head of the Manhattan Project, described Truman's decision as he was a little boy on a toboggan. He could barely hold on. He certainly couldn't steer. And so it ends on August 6th, and it ends on August 6th with a photograph from the air, either of the city destroyed or of the mushroom cloud. So from the perpetrator's perspective, looking down on Hiroshima, and that's the story. So in the American narrative, there are no Japanese people. There is Hiroshima. There's no Japanese people, no Japanese person is named, no description of what happens to Japanese people is there. So the gist of our argument in this article is that this is half the story. This is like looking at a war crime and obsessing over the criminal's preparations and talking about the criminal's state of mind and talking about where the criminal shopped for the things they were going to use in this war crime or to kill someone. And then when you get to the point of the crime, then you're done with the story. And so the historical work that went into determining all of this stuff, to find all this history out, that's fine. That's great. That should be a part of the historical record. But every year there's this obsessing over it, almost this, delicious fascination with it, where people every day will live tweet what happened today, what material was moved from Los Alamos down to Alamogordo, which order was signed between which person in the Manhattan Project. And it's kind of crazy. It's a little bit obsessive to focus. The narrative is it's a war crime. It's about use of weapons of mass destruction against human beings. And that should be the key of the story. The story shouldn't be how clever the criminals were, how clever the killers were. And so in essence, this is the gist of the article, is that we need to tell this story focusing on what happened and focusing on who it happened to. It's as though we were to tell, in the United States, retell the history of slavery by strictly talking about owners of slaves and never quite getting into what happened to the slaves or who they were, or what their lives were like, or how they moved forward from that point. So this is the gist of the article.
Interesting. Bo, I've always found it interesting that you quite self-consciously mention the attacks upon the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Often the way people phrase this is in a passive construction, the bombings of, which, evade any personal responsibility or malicious intent.
If you want to understand how political it is, just think about this. When is the last time that you ever heard about the bombs dropping on Pearl Harbor? No, Pearl Harbor was attacked, right? But bombs dropped on Hiroshima. There's the politics of it right there. That tells you everything you need to know about how the discourse tells you, what's acceptable and what's not acceptable.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Yuki, Professor Miyamoto, you mentioned that you've led You mentioned that you have led a number of trips to Japan, right, to Hiroshima, often with foreign students. And as a person whose family has suffered from this tragedy and having grown up there, what is your take on this and the dialogue between these Americans who are coming maybe with a very heartfelt need to understand what happened there, but also being affected by these political narratives and the way that they've processed the information that they're seeing? How do your students respond to that?
Right. There are a couple of students that I remember vividly. One of them is her grandfather was actually captured in the Philippines and brought to Osaka as an American POW. He's like 6 foot tall, but by the time he was released in 1945, he weighed like 90 pounds. And so he came back to the US and built his family, and that's why you are here. And that's the story that she grew up with. And so I was very impressed that to begin with, she was interested in coming to Japan with me. And unfortunately, I sometimes have students sort of assume that from my attributes that my teaching is all about Japanese victimhood stories. So I was, well, which is, I tried not to, but I was very impressed by her. And after the trip, she was kind of reserved student. She didn't talk much, but I can tell that she is thinking. She was thinking deeply, and she was very eager to talk to Hibakusha and to other people, and came back still thinking. You know, she had to unpack her experiences at home, but of course that story was very new to her family members. And she invited me over to meet her grandfather. And she also went back to Hiroshima once again to attend the city's lecture series in summer, which Bo is one of the lecturers there. And at the end of the day, she says, well, yes, she said, well, there is an understanding that there was the bomb. Because of the bomb, I am here. But there is another story. It's not just that. So she was trying to, I think she's still struggling with this. And I think, you know, having more than one narrative makes you feel uneasy. You know, you have to have some kind of maturity or patience to deal with ambiguities. And that's I think where she is. And that was very moving. But sometimes I feel that I am not able to succeed, because what I want to do is, or what I want them to think about is not only that, you know, those people, a horrible event, oh, you know, unfortunate, such a pity, and that's it, you know, and then cried, but that really doesn't do anything in their lives. That's what I want to avoid. And I want them to realize that there are actually hibakusha in the United States as well. And that will eventually, in the long run, contribute to understanding Hiroshima in a more deeper level. So in terms of the objectives of this trip is not necessarily learning about those poor people, like, oh, that's too bad, not that kind, but rather realizing that radiation effects and long-lasting emotional and the physical actual effects. And speaking of that, one time I had a conversation with a person who was deeply involved in the 80s anti-nuclear movement, anti-nuclear weapon movement. And his narrative was, well, we have to abolish these nuclear weapons. It's because we could be attacked. You know, this is such a horrible weapon. We cannot be attacked. We cannot be wiped away by this. But I think there are already so many people suffering without actual bombing, actual explosion. For example, vicinity of Hanford. I was showing the picture of Richland High School, but that's also the place where a lot of people who are suffering from radiation exposure, but they are not able to talk about it publicly. So that's the kind of similarities between Fukushima and Hanford, and perhaps many other places on Earth. But those are the awareness that I want my students to have. Thanks.
Just if I can ask Yuki, do your students and Norma too in America, in your years of working with students around these issues, do you find that many or any American students have any knowledge about what happened in their own country at all?
Okay, thank you for asking. Actually, surprisingly, no. When I mentioned Hanford, most of the students didn't know, unless you have a friend who is from there, or you yourself, you know, student herself is from there. Los Alamos, perhaps a little bit more, but Hanford, and I'm not sure about Oak Ridge. But Hanford especially, I feel like students don't know what the place is about, and which is the same in Japan as well. You know, when the Richland High School's mascot was very much prevalent, became big news in Japan a couple of years ago when a Japanese student, high school student, went there as an exchange student and made a video which was released after she left. But I don't know how, I don't know people in Japan who watched that news actually made an association of Richland with Hanford nuclear site. What about you, Norma? What's your experience?
Agree. And I see that Sarah Fox has responded to both, saying fewer than 10% of her students know about any U.S. nuclear history beyond Los Alamos. They really don't know anything. And after Fukushima happened, there's an interesting moment where I've had students, and depending on where you are teaching, this will be a much more important phenomenon. I remember the productive awkwardness of having students who were able to be at the University of Chicago because their town sited a nuclear power plant or their fathers worked in a nuclear power plant. And there was a beginning of, there was a dawning reflection that there is something about living with nuclear technologies that might not work. Now, whether in the subsequent years that could work backwards to take in the nuclear history, I think that is a task for educators now, is to bring these elements together. And of course, I mean, as an aside, COVID, of course, is enormously risky for the maintenance of nuclear reactors all around the world, because those are places where people can't work to distance themselves, etc. And I believe the NRC early on decided that working up to 80 hours a week for a shift was within permissible levels of safety. And, you know, I don't do anything besides sit at my desk, and working 80 hours a week would be what? Devastating. So there are so many dots that need to be connected, and I think are ready to be connected right now because we have these overlapping catastrophes. I want to say one more thing about teaching, and this is a little bit to go to a question about Japanese education narratives of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Is I would often get East Asian students in my nuclear classes. And that was also a very productive experience. Most of them had grown up with the thought that they were free because of their countries were liberated thanks to the US atomic bombs. There are generational shifts there, but as many of these East Asian students are also caught up in the allure of Japanese popular culture, they're interested in learning more, and they're also, some of them had to conceal from their parents that they were taking a course on nuclear weapons, beginning in the US and going through Chernobyl, Marshall Islands, Chernobyl, and down to Fukushima. They could not confess to their parents that they were bothering to study about anything that involved Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So that tension of coming to see what the impact of historical events had been on distinct populations, if you think along the terms of nation states, and then you think in terms of human populations in the environment. It was that process that I was hoping could be initiated in these classes, so that we would, of course, be conscious of what Japan had done in Asia, Asia Pacific, and then, but also that this radioactive exposure does not privilege people.
It's remarkable that when the Trump administration was, trying to enact a change of policy with regard to North Korea, still you see very little connection between the narratives, particularly the media narratives, and the ways in which they talk about nuclear weapons proliferation and commercial nuclear energy, as these are entirely different worlds. Bo, this is something that you've written on.
Yeah, and I'd point out that it always seems crazy to me that, North Korea having the weapon, we won't tolerate that, or Iran having the weapon, having a nuclear weapon, that's just something we can't live with. And we've manufactured over 70,000 of these weapons. the US and the Soviet Union, or now Russia, have always had well over 90% of the weapons, conducted well over 90% of the tests. But the thought that somebody else has it, that's, you know, it always struck me as like, you know, somebody with 17 pies just being outraged that somebody has a sliver of pie. You know, it's just a crazy thing. But let's see, actually, I forgot. Sorry, what was that second part of what you said about the relation to nuclear power?
Well, just the disconnect between commercial nuclear energy and nuclear weapons.
Exactly. You know, and you know, as I said, nuclear power comes from manufacturing plutonium. You take a look at that same discourse, right? Trump saying that North Korea, it's not acceptable, for North Korea's behavior is not acceptable, it's a threat, it's a risk. This is the same administration that has proposed rule changes to redefine high-level radioactive waste as low-level radioactive waste, which is essentially to say that the federal government is no longer responsible to remediate or clean up high-level waste that it produced. So at Hanford, Washington, where so much plutonium was produced, there's 177 tanks full of chemical and radiological waste that are buried in the ground. And they're all leaking. They've all been leaking. And what this is that in order to extract plutonium from fuel rods, you have to put it into vats of acid to dissolve the metals. And so this liquid is that liquid material to separate so it's dangerous chemically, and it's full of small particles of both plutonium and uranium, and there's just these gigantic tanks of it. And this is a massive problem. There's an underground plume of radiation moving from this leaked liquid towards the Columbia River. And so something needs to be done with this waste. Well, what's the Trump administration, and not like the other administrations before it did better, you know, what's the solution? Let's just call it something different, and then it's no longer a risk. So the idea of a government somewhere having a couple of nuclear weapons is just outrageous, and we'll go to war to stop it. But essentially conducting war against our own population by putting this material in the ground and then saying, oh, you know what, it's actually perfectly fine, and walking away from it, you know, that's open warfare. And it's just because it's not weapons, because it's radiological waste, in this case from the production of weapons, it's you know, it's just nothing to see, nothing to think about. And you know, and those connections just go, you know, look at Japan. Japan is a country without nuclear weapons, is a country with the three principles, as Norma was talking about, and with 47 tons of plutonium. You know, Japan could have nuclear weapons in a year or two if Japan decided to have nuclear weapons.
Nice.
That position consciously. So, you know, the line between these is a very thin line, and it's mostly projected rhetorically. So the line between these is a really, really thin line.
And yet when Obama visited Hiroshima, I mean, it was a very different kind of historical moment. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition. We're living in such a parallel universe to that time. It's hard to imagine that this was only a number of years ago.
If I might, as the American cynic here, Obama, virtually, I think it was 2 months before he visited Hiroshima, he essentially put forward a plan to modernize American nuclear weapons, to spend $1.5 trillion over 30 years and modernize American nuclear weapons and all delivery systems. So these were the policies he was enacting as he came to Hiroshima. And not only did he use passive language that the bomb dropped, he said death fell from the sky. And most egregiously to me, or rather most demonstrative of this contradiction, is he brought the nuclear football with him to the Peace Park. The nuclear football is a suitcase. It's the mobile command center for a US president to be able to authorize the launching of nuclear weapons. And according to American military policy, it can never be more than 100 yards away from the president when the president is away from a command center. Because if suddenly the Russians launched missiles, well, the president would have 5 or 10 minutes in order to get our missiles off before they would be destroyed. So he always has to be close to this. And so when he came to the Peace Park, that came with him. He brought the ability to launch nuclear weapons into the Peace Park. So it was a really beautiful public relations moment. It's a discourse moment. And I'm not saying that there wasn't genuine emotion there and that people didn't feel all kinds of things that were really true, but that can't cover up the actions that were taking place along with the comfort and the warmness of seeing human beings hug each other. We can't imagine our current president as Americans hugging another human being ever.
Kyle, may I add a little bit?
Of course.
Okay, thank you. Well, there is one line I skipped in my presentation was that actually that tour in 1950 that Meya Hamai went, Nakasone Yasuhiro was on that trip too, because the US saw him as a rising power. And as you know, he came back and in 1954, right after the Bikini incident, he actually proposed a large amount of budget to build a nuclear power plant. So this seems to be very connected, and I'm not going into a conspiracy theory, but it's interesting that in the 50s, Reagan was big on commercial on GE, and on the other side, Nakasone in the 50s pushing so hard the nuclear power plant, and both became the head of the states in the 80s, and which was, I think, a coincidence. But at the same time, if politicians adamantly against the nuclear power, they probably wouldn't have been the top. And then that speaks to how this nuclear discourse is also very political issue. And getting to Bo's comment about Obama's visit to Hiroshima, and you are talking about this image of hugging and stuff, and that hugging image was very prevalent in Japan. President Obama hugged this Japanese person, but he was known for digging the truth about American POWs who were killed by the bombing. So it seems a reconciliation, but again, as Bo was saying, it's American story. It's about Americans. So it's an interesting irony there, which was not so much talked about in Japan. In Japan, it was not necessarily about American story. That was not consciously discussed. Thank you.
Thank you. If I could raise a couple of questions here that are kind of conjoined from the audience. Pinar Tomasin asks, mentions that these are very important issues to be highlighted, and mentions that from this person's experience living and studying in Hiroshima, that they did not see solidarity or support for Fukushima people. Ron Zegenberg, who, by the way, gave a talk at my university on the history of castles in Japan, if you want to see that, that's archived online, raises the issue. He says, I wanted to ask about the connection between Hiroshima and Fukushima. Bo mentioned the march in Chukuku Tenrikyo headquarters. We assume that Hiroshima and Nagasaki activism and anti-nuclear stance was always connected, but it was not always so. Hiroshima activists and organizations like Hidankyo used to support nuke power. Can you perhaps talk about the current situation and the relationship between Fukushima and Hiroshima? And I put that out to any of the panelists.
I can take a start. I still remember vividly in the last course I taught at the University of Chicago before retiring. So in 2012, we were connected to a hibakusha from Hiroshima. And no, I think it was actually 2011 in the fall. And anyway, shortly after. And he made the striking observation that he thought most of his fellow hibakusha had been in favor of nuclear power until about 2 weeks after the Fukushima disaster. That may be an exaggeration for effect, but it is also true that even the most outspoken mayors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki haven't spoken out against nuclear power. We know that power companies are huge donators in various ways, support campaigns and support city finances. I also learned from being on a board of or a committee for a national museum, what a difficult, that in fact it was impossible, I was told, for science museums in Japan to write anything critical, to have exhibits that question nuclear power, because so much of their funding comes from power companies. So I think that the Hiroshima-Fukushima relationship is fascinating if you think about Fukushima people dreading to be identified with Hiroshima, and Nagasaki too, but Hiroshima comes first. And Hiroshima and Nagasaki people, on the one hand, seemingly, I mean, in some ways, there was an aura of hanging on to their distinctive identity as the first A-bombed people, and then secondly, in some ways having their minds and souls tugged at by what they should be thinking about with Chugoku Dendryoku, the big power company in that area, which, when Fukushima happened, at least I thought, thank goodness we're not going to have that new plant near Shimonoseki built. But lo and behold, they're back to reviving their applications for a license. So that was a very short reprieve.
Sorry, I'm always tapping onto someone. I need some time to think about the questions. But I also want to say that the former mayor of Hiroshima, when he had some connections to Chicago, so he was visiting Chicago, and we were having a private conversations, and he was saying that he is against the nuclear power, but he is not able to say it publicly because then he will lose a large amount of votes. So Chugoku Dendryoku is the power company in Chugoku area, including Hiroshima. That is so powerful, and in the same sense that people in Hanford or vicinity of Hanford cannot criticize or cannot voice their concerns about health and radiation in a similar way that they were not able to voice their opposition to nuclear power. And as Norma was pointed out, that this fear of discrimination, someone also said in the chat box that this healthcare, that Hiroshima people's healthcare book, which there was a discussion that people in Fukushima also should make those things, but then some of them didn't want to be associated with Hiroshima and Nagasaki Hibakusha because of the fear of discrimination.
Well, if I could just beside these dynamics which are controlling very much, never doubt the value of a good story. I mean, for example, if something has really harmed you, the notion that now it can be a source of life, that's, as we know, Eisenhower put the atoms for peace. It's really seductive to believe that good will come. Before bad happened, now good will come. And then, that's a simplistic reading, but then also think about the narrative here in Hiroshima and in Nagasaki, which is that people suffered, and that what will come from that is that nobody else will suffer like they have suffered. They will stop other people from suffering the way that they have suffered. And so at the time of the Fukushima disaster was the beginning of the conferences on the humanitarian impact, and which led to the treaty now on the prohibition. And this timing is just perfect for Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which is before the generation of Hibakusha pass. These weapons will be made illegal, and because of the ethical violation that these weapons are, abolition will be compelled and curtain. And it's such a good story, and to have it followed up by all of these new people being exposed to radiation and following up the good part, the part that was supposed to provide life and provide energy, it breaks the story that was supposed to happen, and it complicates it. And it's just distressing. I think for people here is a little bit of the emotional, like Norma, you were mentioning that people didn't want to give up their preciousness in a sense, or they're like that we are victims, we endured this. And also there's a clear moral wrong in what happened to the people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but what happened to the people in Fukushima, it's a muddy wrong. I mean, we know it was wrong, but is power bad? Was this nature? You know, it just turned, I would say that this is one place of tension between these communities.
Bo, you've kind of preempted this. In some ways, you've spoken to the question that I'm about to raise. This was a question raised by Shelby Oxenford, who says, I'm struck by how each speaker brings up both speaking silence and time scale. As Professor Miyamoto put it, that you might not be able to count as a survivor until you die. Professor Jacobs on the problem of deep geological time storage and scale, and Professor Field on managing anxiety and data. And I wonder if the panel can comment more about how the time scale of certain kinds of nuclear harm plays a role in this problem of speaking/silence. And if there is a way of developing a kind of listening or speaking, of developing a kind of language that might allow for speaking about harm and vulnerability on such longer timescales. It's a very thoughtful question.
Thank you for a wonderful question. And I'm very intrigued by the language that this, I read that question in the chat box, and that was a great question. I was intrigued by the language, what she means by this. And I just started grappling with this notion of silence, how this is the weight of silence, how heavy it is in the discourse, because silence can shape the memory, silence can shape the discourse, so that how people see the world, how people understand the incidents and stuff. So I think language is a fascinating topic I just started grappling with. And if the person who posted this question, if she has some ideas about the language, I would love to hear.
Well,
I can chime in if that's okay, or we could speak privately maybe later. But
no, please.
Part of this question actually comes from, and thank you again to the panel for such a fascinating talk. This has been just so amazing. So thank you. But part of my question comes out of teaching the Tokyo fire bombings, and in teaching the testimony, and thinking about in particular that a lot of the survivors of the fire bombings that are on the Tokyo or the Japan air raids online archive, one of the things that they mention is that basically they couldn't tell their story up and until basically people were willing to listen. And so part of how I think about it and how I teach it is in thinking about that it's not just that survivors are speaking, but it's also that there is what we might call like the grounds for listening. And that requires a certain kind of time scale, as well as just a sort of sensitivity to it. And that silence can be just as demonstrative as actual language if we know how to listen around it or listen for it. And that's part of what I'm thinking, since my larger project is on 311, is on thinking about that there is this sort of efflorescence of language and sort of ephemera that happens, but there's a problem of preservation, there's a problem of listening, there's a problem of speaking as well, that all seem to kind of come together, particularly around the fact that, as both Professor Jacobson and Professor Fields' comments talk about in terms of that we're dealing, at least in Fukushima, and as you mentioned with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that some of these things can't be known for a very long time, that vulnerability, you can be vulnerable for a very long time before you actually are harmed by your exposure. And so that seems to all be knotted together. So I don't know if that made that clearer or not, but thank you.
Quick response, which isn't at all to address the richness of your question, but I think that the silence can be so thick in Fukushima now, and I'm thinking, I've talked about it with the other participants before, but someone like Greta Thunberg in Sweden has talked about climate change as the theft of the future for a whole generation. And Bo has his own very pungent line on how it's also, it's theft of the future economically and of the present too. But I think the silencing is a theft of the present also. That to have to spend so much energy shoving out the anxieties in your mind, because the temporality of this, which you're getting at very thoughtfully in your question, is such that the fact that you don't know until the future whether you've really been harmed doesn't mean that you're exempt from worrying about it now and every minute of it. And particularly for parents of children, having to, every time their children come up with things, rashes, for example. I'm thinking of a mother whose testimony I translated in that radiation booklet that Kyle mentioned, saying that she wanted her child exempted from outdoor phys ed in the early months after the disaster, and everybody at the school, anyone who would take her phone calls would say, no, there's no known connection. There's no known connection. So finally, she got a diagnosis that her daughter has an allergic condition, and could she therefore be excused from phys ed? That kind of, she was very brave to actually try to speak on behalf of a daughter, but most people increasingly have not been able to speak out. So that silence is shaping everyday life, I think.
I think from my own studies, one thing that I would add is that this is in a sense part of the difference between people who are affected by radiation in a place like Japan and so many of the people who are affected by radiation in test site communities, for example, especially foreign test site communities, not domestic test site communities, because in those communities, there's just nobody listening, even whether you're silent, whether you're not silent. It's just, there's as loud as you want to be, there's nobody listening. And so I would just emphasize that, for example, managing people after exposures to radiation. This is something that happens in developed countries. And in places like the Marshall Islands or in places like Kazakhstan, they just don't care. They don't care to manage people and to make them have any perceptions at all. So just to point out that distinction of among the various communities.
I'm going to speak to this just for a moment, if I could share my screen. I'd like to mention the work here of a political scientist by the name of John Gaventa. John Gaventa wrote a book called Power and Powerlessness. It was a study of the labor strikes in the coal mines of West Virginia. And he's been working on this project his entire career, but he initially talks about what he calls the 3 dimensions of power. The first dimension is a pluralist model in which, the issues are transparent. The second dimension of power is based upon the mobilization of bias, where issues are suppressed. And so he says we need to distinguish between issues that are discussed, but the non-issues that are never raised either aren't raised because they're consciously suppressed, or maybe not raised at all because people can't even think to raise those issues. But he has this notion of just really that ideology and power are conjoined. You can't understand one without the other. But here's the terminology I wanted to raise to you. It talks about spaces here for participation, closed spaces. And as we know, the nuclear world is very much a closed world. So as we study it, it's often from the outside looking in. And that helps to explain the political divide, the ideological divide between pro and anti-nuclear. You know, many anti-nuclear people really don't have access to the inner workings of what's happening inside the machinery of government and the industries that produce nuclear. And then invited spaces where there is a stage or an arena, what Gaventa calls decision-making arenas for people to be able to participate and to be able to voice their issues and concerns. And then the final is claimed or created spaces. So just to read here, finally, there are the spaces which are claimed by less powerful actors from or against the power holders. Refers to these spaces as organic spaces which emerge out of sets of common concerns or identifications that may become into being as a result of popular mobilization. And I think that that's what we've seen in the anti-nuclear movement, particularly post-Fukushima. We were talking earlier about the connection between Fukushima and Hiroshima. Bo, you had very helpfully set up some interviews with Scott Knowles and a couple of other scholars who had gone on a research trip to Hiroshima a few years ago. And one of the Hibakusha mentioned that she had never spoken about issues of her own experience until Fukushima. And she was very concerned about trying to let these young activists be much more aware of that. And it seems that there's a very strong age stratification in the anti-nuclear movement in Japan, where an older generation that involved in the AMPO anti-security treaty movement in the 1960s had become conjoined to the environmentalist movement, and eventually to the anti-nuclear movement. But what Fukushima brought out was a whole generation, a whole new generation of anti-nuclear activists. Norma, I know that you've studied these issues deeply. And we had seen in the immediate aftermath of the Fukushima disaster, there was a great deal of activists out, these mass meetings and protest rallies out in front of the Prime Minister's office. Do you anticipate when the Olympics, if and when the Olympics eventually are held, that there will be a resurgence of anti-nuclear sentiment in Japan?
Hard to say, huh? Depends on what happens between now and then. I mean, yes, what happened to those demonstrations, that kind of glorious moment of Japanese people showing the world that they can indeed protest, which isn't a surprise for anyone who has more than a 10-decade memory. And yet, I do think this is an issue that I often think about, what's happened to Japanese people. When I thought about the March for Our Lives and the gun violence in Washington, D.C. a couple of years ago, and I was with one a filmmaker and an activist, and we were saying, when could we imagine Fukushima children saying, we are children and we have the right to be protected, right? It's just unimaginable. I think there's not a single answer, but just decades and decades of careful, almost invisible effort that in education, in the ministry-centered education, that has gone into creating a depoliticized citizenry, whereby the word politics it becomes a dirty word often. Politics names activities and thoughts of other people besides you and what they choose to do that you object to, but a way in which municipalities can't sponsor a film screening, never mind giving money to it, because it's political. The absurdity when the voting age was lowered for a social studies teacher, I remember hearing in high school, saying he was trying to figure out how to teach the significance of voting in electoral politics to his students who were getting ready to vote without being political. So I think that's a very large context behind it. Yes, there's a new generation of anti-nuclear activists. They're not so easy to find, in Fukushima anyway. I was very surprised to hear 2 years ago someone saying, oh, there's a new generation of moms in Fukushima. And they worry about things like yanking out the monitoring posts, which were considered inaccurate anyway. And they want to do something about keeping those monitoring posts, because what happens when something happens and there's nothing we can refer to? But they were adamant that they did not want to to be engaging in political activity, and I think especially didn't want to be seen as engaging in political activity. So a friend told me that someone had come to her asking, was engaged in teachers' union. She was assigned to teachers' union at her school. Of course, teachers' unions used to be enormously active until 1995 when they decided to just hold hands with the education ministry. But having at least been in a union, she said, well, I'm supposed to take part in this effort to keep the monitoring posts around, but I'm told that I'm supposed to stand at a street corner and gather signatures for a petition. But how can I how can I attract people to come to approach me? I'm not offering tissue paper, and I'm told I shouldn't have a sign or a banner because that would be political. In other words, how do I engage in this activity without looking political?
Yeah, it's really fascinating, isn't it? At the height of those anti-nuclear rallies, one of my students' photograph was taken and run on the front page of the New York Times. And I congratulated her on this and tried to talk to her about it. And I said, by the way, what's up with this? This is a different name. And she said, oh, that's my activist name. And if you understand the nature of political activism, particularly among young people in Japan, that's fairly common. The SEALDS group, this group that had been both anti-nuclear and kind of anti-Abe nationalism, many of them changed their identities or were very careful about their online presence because they were afraid that eventually when they applied for jobs, people would be Googling their name and would affect their long-term prospects. And in fact, they more or less closed that organization down when they graduated. And at my university, we just had a march a month ago. There was about 3,500 people from not only students, but it was started by a young woman from Temple University's Japan campus named Sarah Todd. But what I find a little disturbing is that there doesn't seem to be a lot of linkage between these various activists, you know, the Me Too movement, the nationalist politics and anti-war movement, and then the nuclear politics. They seem to be, at least from my vantage point, they seem to be somewhat disconnected. There's a lack of coherence there. Well, speaking of politics, there's an interesting question here. It's rather political, I guess. Cornelius raises the question, I wonder whether or not the organizers and speakers would have found it desirable to have a representative of the nuclear industry or a politician supporting nuclear power on the panel to make the discussion a little more diverse and interesting. Well, I think it's pretty interesting as it is, but if I could address that issue, we have among our panelists here the filmmaker Reggie Life. And Reggie's done a number of really interesting films. Has a film called Doubles about multi-ethnicity and the Black experience in Japan. And we staged a film screening of his film entitled The Taylor Anderson Story. Taylor Anderson was a young American woman who was on the JET program living up in Tohoku, and she was killed by the tsunami. There were only a couple of Americans killed by the tsunami. And in the Q&A, one of the people in the audience asked the filmmaker, Reggie Life, said, well, look, there were almost 20,000 Japanese people killed in the tsunami. And here you've chosen to do a documentary on only one of a couple of Americans that were killed on this. And isn't that somehow, you know, it's not representational. And I thought Reggie had a very interesting answer to that. He said, well, what you've mentioned is very worthy of consideration. And that's a film that I would like to see. And if you would make that film, I would be very happy to see it. But this is the film that I made, right? So I guess the point I would make here is that this could have been a panel comprised of a dozen people. And it obviously would have been very different if we would have had a kind of intellectual food fight going on here between pro and anti-nuclear perspectives. But I do think that it's important to, particularly when we're educating young people about these issues, is to map the range of these issues and to understand, you know, the nature of that political divide between the pro and anti-nuclear perspective. I don't know if this is a direct answer to that, but Thomas Bass wrote, whataboutism and the phony representation of two sides to this issue are not likely to be helpful. But I'd like to throw this issue out. It's really a deeper issue, though, about mapping the range of political discourse on a topic like this.
Well, one of the things that I would say is that, you know, we are organisms that have grown and been nurtured in one side of this debate our entire lives. We're immersed in a culture that is essentially telling us one aspect of it. So just to critique it and look at the dynamics of how, you know, here in Japan, there are over 50 nuclear power plants. In my country, the United States, there's over 100 nuclear power plants and 70,000 nuclear weapons were manufactured. So one side has spoken loudly with its acts. And I think that the scholarship of the people who are here is focused on looking at certain questions, and for us to have an engaged and complicated discussion, we need to focus on what it is that we've studied rather than focus on why people disagree with what we've studied. There's plenty of opportunities for that. And so I think that, you know, we are, the three of us that are speaking as panelists, we are all working at universities, but you could probably count on the three of us on our 30 fingers, the people who are paid professionally to advocate anti-nuclear policies around the world as professional public relations people. But the number of people working in public relations on behalf of the nuclear industry, certainly in the hundreds, if not thousands of people. So I don't think that what we're in is a discourse that is starved for people, for views that are counter to the ones we're discussing. So what we're talking about here is an in-depth look at what those of us working on this side have found, and a dialogue about that between practitioners. So I think that that's how I would respond. It's ridiculous to try to, very few things in the world are fair. So every discussion doesn't have to be representing all sides.
If I can just add a word to that, I'm thinking, I mean, for example, there are Fukushima people who have held monthly meetings with TEPCO. This also happened in 3 Mile Island, I learned last year, of women actually who would have discussions, I guess, with the NRC representative. So one can attempt to have a dialogue with these people. I don't know that there's a desire for dialogue, a two-sided desire for dialogue in such cases, which I don't rule out. The more interesting dialogue that I want, and this is actually a practical problem I face, is the one that Shelby brought up earlier, is how can someone like me, known to have the position she has, how can someone like me find a way to have a dialogue, or really to have a dialogue with the people who have stayed on and who don't want to talk about it and who are riven with anxiety, but very determined to put the best face on it. That would be a listening in the first instance on my part, and perhaps a dialogue that could happen. Covert questions do get asked. I mean, I have a friend who stayed on, who has deliberately modulated how she couches her gatherings because she wants the new, young, nervous generation of moms not to be scared off. So she works on, tease around aromatherapy. That's very safe. But maybe if you have kept meeting each other, talking about aromatherapy, someday when you're really worried about exposure, you dare to voice those words. Or also she said she was approaching someone for some, again, very safe, welcoming, festive event. And she said, this woman I called said, by the way, and this is 8 years after the disaster, I've always wanted to ask someone, is it really safe to live here? I mean, like what's going on with radiation? So she could do this by telephone to one person, a question she'd wanted to ask for 8 years, right? So that's the dialogue I'm looking for.
And now Norma nicely put it. I would like to say we, three of us, are concerned about those people who struggle with silence, how to break silence. And sometimes those silence and pressure are internalized in those people, whereas politicians and representatives, they have large platforms. No one is stopping them from. They are not struggling in, internalized pressure or that's I'm assuming. So we are dealing with silence. And speaking of politics, I'm also kind of piggybacking what Kyle was talking about, what is considered as politics. And I was remembering that a friend of mine in Hiroshima, she wanted to show the cats of Miri Kitani at Hiroshima University. And some of you might have seen it. It's about an artist, a homeless artist who was interned in Japanese, as a Japanese American who was interned during the Second World War, and he also learned that his extended family stayed in Hiroshima were obliterated by the bomb. So but it's almost about the friendship between this artist who happened to meet or came across this man, Mr. Miri Kitani. But Hiroshima University said, well, this is too political. So political is used to anything against the mainstream, or if in the case of Japan, against Abe, Prime Minister Abe's administration. So speaking of that power dynamics, I don't think that what we are doing is too impartial. What we are doing is to subvert that kind of power and to reveal the power structure. So I guess that's probably how I would defend myself and the panel.
Well, I don't think we need to defend our views on this, really. It's actually, I think Bo has raised it very well, which is that we're contributing to a larger discourse that often doesn't have a voice. I know among my students, when I'm teaching about these issues, to the extent that I can represent both sides of this debate, I try to do that. But often if you're just talking about the nuclear industry, or you're talking about the way in which the industry is built, it almost has its defense built into the way in which it's been structured. And I've come to believe that really it's a larger debate about politics. It's not even necessarily a debate about nuclear energy per se. It's about state politics. It's about democracy. It's about powerless people having a voice. I know, Bo, this is something that you've, again, written very extensively on. If I could draw you out on that.
Well, it's been mentioned here, the amount of political money donated in advertising in newspapers, and the leveraging of discourse by the pro-nuclear side. And it's one of the ways that I would bring up too, that is less overt, less heavy-handed, but incredibly controlling of how people can understand where a lot of this silence gets nurtured in people, so that they're unable to speak about their concerns. And that is the way that we are presented with medical information about risks from radiation. Almost always the way that people who are exposed to radiation are spoken to about whether there's dangers to them or not is based in the lifespan study from the ABCC, now the RERF, which is the decades-long study of the health and mortality of the hibakusha in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that study is entirely focused on external radiation, because what happened primarily to people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki is a giant burst of gamma radiation that just passes through your body entirely. And it lasts only a minute, less than a minute, but it can damage all the cells in your body if you're close enough to it, or do a lot of damage to the body. And that study, because this was such a large effect here in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, being close to the detonation of a bomb, the study consciously chose, from the people who designed the study and operated it, consciously chose not to include harm from internalized radioactive particles, which is what happens with fallout. And so part of the reason that this was just research that was delicious to do. I mean, you have this unbelievable opportunity to gather all of this data of prior to this, the number of people that have been exposed to radiation were, and then their health was tracked, was a couple dozen people in the world. So it was a really powerful and a useful study, but in a sense, it predicted the future badly, because what happened to people was not that they were subject to nuclear explosions. What happened to people was they were subject to radioactive fallout. And so the people in Fukushima who are worried about their health, the people at Fukushima who are uncertain about the risks to radiation, the thing that is tangibly real, that is a risk to them, is the fallout, is the particles that have deposited all throughout the region and that finds its way into food. That's what's in food, is particles, and that people can internalize into their bodies. Well, in order to calm people down about whether their children are in danger or whether they themselves are in danger, this study is what is used to tell them whether they're at risk or not. And this is a study that only tells you you're at risk if you're exposed to a very large amount, a substantial amount of external radiation. That's not what people in Fukushima are experiencing. They're experiencing fallout, like the people in the black rain suit 75 years later, getting some small justice. And so because radiation is a complicated thing, and because there is a large institutionalized authoritative study that tells you you're not at risk, that makes you silent, because how do you counter that? How do you know why that's not accurate for you and the risks that you're facing? And it's used to calm people. It's used to manage people. It's also the only metric we have. The only metric we have is studies of external exposures to radiation. And so this is an institutional way and also an active way to essentially try to take legitimate fears people have and pacify them. And if you are if you're almost anybody on Earth and you don't understand the different dynamics of different types of exposures to radiation, what can you do except say that, well, people who know much more than me are telling me I have no risk and that it's totally safe. So who am I, because I'm anxious, who am I to counter that? And so this is the dynamic for almost all the people who've been exposed to radiation since 1945, and why they're dismissed and why they're invisible. And even people in a developed country like Japan, with access to technology and with access to media, it's still almost impossible to grasp what the risks to you are. So I would just point out that as a critical dynamic. And the science in the lifespan study is good science. It's just being applied badly. It's being applied to the wrong people in the wrong situation in a place like Fukushima.
To follow on this, Bo, I'm raising a question here by William Kinsella, who says, there's a slogan that says we are all downwinders. I think that's true and has value in raising people's awareness. I grew up on the US East Coast, and now we know that places even there were testing fallout hotspots. Nevertheless, I wonder whether or not there are trade-offs in characterizing virtually all of us specifically as hibakusha. Could that be seen as an appropriation of a sacred term that should be reserved for the actual bomb victims?
Personally, I would say no. We have to have distinctions. You know, Hiroshima and Nagasaki hibakusha are a very specific thing, but this is one of the reasons I use the phrase hibakusha in the expression global hibakusha, is that many people only think of people from Hiroshima and Nagasaki as being people who were exposed to radiation, possibly Chernobyl people too. And so on the one hand, it's using a discursive tool that can effectively communicate to people that this is a similar kind of harm that people have. And even like I myself, as we all do, have some traces of nuclear testing radiation inside of my body. So calling everybody a hibakusha isn't so much saying that I am in exactly the same position that somebody who was a kilometer away from the detonation of the bomb in Nagasaki was. What it's saying is that the experience of living in a radioactive world and having risk from radiation is globally is a global experience. And as time goes on, those particles spread deeper and deeper and deeper and wider and wider and wider. And so it's not an equivalence. What it is recognizing that this didn't just happen to a discrete group of people, and everybody else has avoided encountering radiation and encountering these particles. So this is what I would say. And I would also, to the degree that you want to look at the discursive term as sacred, I would say that it is a way long past the passing of the generation of Hibakusha for that identity and that identity and its ultimate origins and link to that group of people will live on, is part of the way I look at it.
Everyone, we've run over the designated time, and just privately we've chatted and agreed to go for a little bit longer. So we'll go until half after the hour, which is about another 15 minutes, which should allow for 2 or 3 or more questions.
Can I say something about Hibakusha, Kyle?
Yeah, please.
Okay, there are 2 ways to write Hibakusha in Japanese. And one is a person who was exposed to the bomb, and the other is the person who is exposed to radiation. So there are 2 ways, but I also think that confining Hiroshima and Nagasaki Hibakusha to only the bomb part is something I'm also against, because we also have to remind ourselves that they are also exposed to radiation. So in that sense, I very much appreciate the sensibility that using the caution to use the term Hibakusha, applying it to other people who are suffering. I'm grateful for that sensitivity, but at the same time, what we need right now seems to me the visibility, because there is silence, there is some hesitation, there is dominant narrative. And for this visibility, some kind of bonding, some kind of common identity, which seems to be more beneficial. And lastly, I'm a little bit hesitant about, on the one hand, I appreciate that sensitivity, and I certainly don't want to downgrade Hibakusha's struggle and the plight, but also I'm hesitant of consecrating Hibakusha in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Their struggle, their plight, we can learn a lot from, but also consecrating them seems to go into a different direction, and sometimes it's called Hiroshima nationalism. And so we are the first, you should listen to us. That sort of special treatment has two sides, and that's something I'm hesitant about. So at this moment, it seems that the visibility, having common identity, and talking publicly about radiation and the radiation exposure seems to have more benefit. And in Fukushima, people cannot even say a word, hoshano, which is radiation. That's where we are. So I hope that going back to Shelby's question of language, that's where we probably have to tackle with. Thank you.
Yuki, on a related note, in previous correspondence outside this session, you had written to me that you had brought a group, you and your colleagues had brought to some Nagasaki hibakusha to Hanford, where plutonium for the Nagasaki bomb was made, and were struck by the attitude of anti-nuclear activists in Richland who welcomed the hibakusha in you. However, they adamantly denied any influence from radiation exposure living in the proximity to Hanford, although the news that the plutonium particles were found in downtown Richland had appeared in a local newspaper. So why is it difficult to discuss radiation exposure? Or more importantly, why is it difficult for them to see themselves as victims of radiation? Well, it seems much less problematic to host a Nagasaki survivor.
since this project actually is not my thing, it's more like core, and definitely Norma and the Bo played a big role out of it. So I would like to defer that question to Norma and Bo.
Sure, Norma. Need to turn your audio on, Norma. Can't hear you, Norma.
Sorry, I'm sorry, I missed the last part of the question, of what Yuki was saying. No, it's what we found that they were unwilling to address. Yeah.
Yeah, they can. So this is what you're talking about, dissociation themselves from, or alienation of victimhood.
Yeah, it's something I've often thought, that what has gone on in Fukushima is the alienation of the victims from their own alienation, imposed and self-imposed, and we couldn't help thinking that that was also going on in Richland. The anti-nuclear activists who were very active and very compelling in their observance of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki anniversaries and the need for world peace, etc., but absolutely would not address it, and if they were to refer to it, would say that it had no impact on their own health. Even in the same breath, telling us about instances in the neighborhood of so-and-so, oh, that 10-year-old has leukemia, and then there's brain tumor in my family, and this, but still denial that there is any relationship. It's also the case, I felt from the early years of teaching about this issue, that it's easy enough to find, even in the United States, people who are opposed to nuclear weapons. It's been much harder to find people who are opposed to nuclear power. And to get the two to be connected is an important struggle. Yeah.
One of the questions that's been raised by a couple of people in here is whether or not just what the health impact of radiation has been in Fukushima. And is that something that we have any objective understanding of by now? I know that's a very politically laden question and answer, but Bo, would you like to address that?
Jump in. I would say that for me, when I look at this situation, I look at it in a continuum with other places where clouds have deposited a lot of radiation into ecosystems. And what you can say is that at 10 years out, a small portion of the disease load is slightly coming into view. And the presentation of disease in these cases typically unfolds over 20 or 30 years and often in pretty predictable ways. In every place where there's been significant deposits of fallout, first you see the thyroid cancers. There's a progression to the way that these diseases nurture in the body and present. And so what we can say is that in Fukushima, there has been a large deposit of radiation and people are living with it. And its effects on them will reveal themselves over time. But it's never been the case that a population in this situation did not present serious disease loads over time. Mm-hmm. But you can't say specifically what it is right now because it's at the early stages of its presentation into a visible form.
I like the phrase by the philosopher Hegel, the night in which all cows are black. You know, until some light, the light of history is cast upon this shadow, we're never really going to know what the actual situation has been. There's a dictum in sociology by W.I. Thomas, what he calls the definition of the situation. If something is real in a person's consciousness, it's real in its consequences. So in a manner of speaking, it doesn't really matter what's objectively true, whatever that means. If people believe it to be so, and that affects their emotional, understanding of it, then that in and of itself is very real. And I think that gets to just how inclusive or exclusive we define radiological effects, whether or not you're looking at like a cellular level for some biological mechanism that leads to a cancer, or more inclusively, if you look at the stress, the post-traumatic stress syndrome that so many people are suffering from, that obviously has physiological impacts as well.
Hey, just one more moment. One of the things that happens, like take a look at Chernobyl. This is what we'll do in Fukushima. This is what we do as we move through history from these events, is that we get down the road from it and we turn back and we count cancers and we call that the impact of the events.
Right.
How many people died at Chernobyl? Well, we can argue about that. How many people were affected by Chernobyl, had their lives completely disrupted by Chernobyl? Well, probably about 1 million people. We can look at Fukushima. We'll look back and we'll count cancers. That's not the story of what happened in Fukushima. You have hundreds of thousands of people whose lives were completely disrupted. Many of those people will live with deep worry, very real and legitimate worry for the rest of their lives. And so to reduce down what the impacts are to counting cancers is really a disservice to human beings.
Norma, we're about out of time. Would you like to respond to these issues?
Thank you. Just speak strictly about the psychological aspect. There again, they have us in a way, and Boser has talked about it early on, the term radiophobia. You know, that the worst aspect of exposure is radiophobia. And if you can get over that psychological issue, you can, then the problem is solved. And so absolutely what Kyle just said, the psychological impact is huge. And no one said that stress is good for the body. It's just that this phenomenon envelops individuals and communities. And secondly, I've been thinking about the way when Bo talked about how medical information is imparted, there's another thing that I wanted to share so that you can keep your eyes open for it. There's a way in which the international nuclear regulatory bodies have adopted this discourse of stakeholders and now co-expertise, addressing people who live on in radiation contaminated sites. So they don't ever allow the possibility that maybe it would be good to move you, but instead, since you're there because you know that's the sensible thing to do, there are various ways in which you can continue to live there. And so a big topic that comes up now, and ICRP type people, there'll be a new document coming out this year, I think, is ethics. So I'm using the word co-opted, as someone inhabiting Fukushima, perhaps because you have no choice. And that's something else we might think about when we use the term hibakusha is many people stay on because they have no choice, and people who get away are able to because they have the means to get away, however hard that is. So because you're staying on, we will work, we have made it our ethical issue, we experts, to help you process this experience. And also, because we call you stakeholders and we acknowledge your co-expertise, we are asking you to own this. So this is another line of development that's taken place. I am very grateful for this occasion to have this chance to share these, to report and share the worries that we have about how best we might live up to our moment. And I think I'll quote Ruiko Muto, who's the head of the group that actually made possible the criminal trial of TEPCO executives. And she was asked to write recently on the parallels between the nuclear disaster and the pandemic. And she lays out similarities and differences. And she says, but if we don't, all of us, make some effort to figure out what is most important, what our priorities should be, and do everything we can to try to face up to the truth, then there really is no hope, no hope for our species or the earth. So I think that is our shared responsibility.
That's wonderfully spoken, Norma. I very appreciate that. And that should be an aspiration for us all. Not only to have a deeper understanding, but to have more empathy for the people who've suffered from this. So I just want to thank all the panelists here for your time and forbearance. We've talked quite a lot leading up to this. I know you've been busy with other sessions, all of you. Bo has to get up at 9 o'clock in the morning for yet another webinar, so you're a real trooper for hanging in there, Bo. So this session has been recorded, and it will be posted on Temple University's website. We have an archive through the Institute of Contemporary Asian Studies. It'll eventually be on YouTube within a couple of weeks, I suppose. I'll be taking care of that. If you have any inquiries, please feel free to reach out to me. I think you can easily find the email addresses of the other panelists as well. But once again, thank you very much for just a wonderful session, and thanks for your time and insight. Okay, everybody, we're going to sign off now. Okay, let's be in touch. Thank you.